like I say, there's a lot going on in the markets. Man, it's absolutely incredible. You guys are aware. We are truly in uncharted water. And it's not just the U.S., it's a global basis. Our firm, we look at totally focused on the global protein markets, beef, pork, poultry, dairy. We do some work in the grains. But that's really what our focus is to try and keep tabs and a finger on the pulse of all these different markets and pull it back and say, what does it mean to our market? And I can tell you, and I think you'll agree as we go through this, the key driver is our global market today. Absolutely, without a doubt, in the beef markets, and it has been in some of the other proteins, but it's a global market today. If you look at this map I put on the slide, I put that on for a reason. That's called an Australia-centered map. So it's not the map you usually see of the world, but you can see Australia, the Pacific Ocean, and Asia right there. The reason I did this, I'm going to click a button, you're going to see a circle appear here. See that red circle? There are more people living inside that circle than outside that circle in the world today. That's Asia. That includes China, Korea, Japan, Indonesia, India, the Philippines. That little area of the world has more people than the entire rest of the world combined. And if you talk to the big shipping companies that do global freight, they would tell you that the ships coming out of that are the main haul. It's electronics. It's everything you buy that says made in China is all coming across the Pacific. The ships going back to Asia are the back haul. That's the cheap freight, is getting stuff back to Asia. And I think as we look at numbers and look at demographics and fast forward 20 years, that back haul may switch. Because here we have a region that's very densely populated that's also very resource deficient. And that deficiency is growing very quickly. Talk more about that as we move on. So my outline, I've been charged to talk about the global markets and also talk about the domestic markets. And so I do a lot of work still with Cattle Facts. I was out for their Outlook meetings last week. And if you were there, some of these slides may look familiar. But I talked to Randy last week and I said, I'm going to Iowa and I'm talking beef and I don't want to just give the global piece. I want to be able to say, here's what the Cattle Facts forecasts are. So this is a joint Cattle Facts presentation now. We turned it into that. So I could include some of their Outlook slides from last week on where they're forecasting prices into next year. So these record beef prices are not just a U.S. scenario. This is a global phenomenon. It is absolutely staggering to me to see what's happened on a global basis in the beef markets. And I've been talking about it for 7 years, but we're just starting to see kind of the dog hit the end of the chain. Will supply catch up to demand, and when? And that's what we're going to go through today. So if you look at the global protein situation, like I say, I grew up on a ranch in Wyoming and I didn't get out much. And now my job takes me all over the world. One thing I've learned, the beef always tastes best in the U.S. It's pretty tough to beat U.S. beef. But the other thing is, it's a very complicated world. And so that picture you see on the top over there, the beef, you can tell it's beef. What that is, that's very thin sliced shaved beef that's rolled up and frozen. That's the beef. 90% of Chinese beef consumption is served that way. It's sliced thin, it's rolled up. Some of you maybe been to China. And then when you eat it at the restaurant, they bring it out just like that, frozen on the tray. And you have a hot pot of boiling water or boiling chili paste or boiling whatever they're boiling. And you take the beef and you boil it. So when we get to these slides and talk about how China is now the #1 beef importer in the world, they're boiling all of that beef. It is boiled beef. Now, you know what it just destroys it. You pull it out of the hot pot and you're like, oh, it's just stringy boiled beef. Someday somebody's going to grill some beef over there and it's really going to take off. Because the boiled beef it's just boiled beef. But what that means to us is every restaurant in China, if you want to be a top shelf restaurant in China, all of your consumers get to see the beef raw because it's served that way. Everyone has learned what yellow fat beef is, which is grass-fed beef, or dairy cow beef in China, compared to white fat beef, which is grain-fed. And so there is a huge search in China to get your hands on some white fat beef. And that's really fueling this market. Now today, China remains closed. We cannot ship beef to China due to the BSE bans from 10 years ago. But Hong Kong's open, and we're sending a lot of beef into Hong Kong. Don't know if there's media here, wink, wink. I can't really talk about that. We got to be careful how we discuss that. But the Chinese market is going to open, and I think it's going to open sooner than later. China just recently opened to Brazilian beef. They just opened to Irish beef. They have runaway beef inflation. We'll talk about that. But the market's alive and well in China. Other pictures, we've got the mix of companies and countries. And one thing we've found, it's tough for the U.S. government to go to China and say, we have a food issue we need to resolve. It's easier if Walmart U.S. goes to Walmart China and says, we have a food issue with your government we need to resolve. It's interesting to see the global dynamics of multinational corporations at being able to bust down trade barriers better than governments can. Now this picture on the left, I wish I'd blown that up bigger, especially for you people from Iowa. I don't know if you've ever seen a machine that stacks corn like that. That's dried corn in the air. It's not a machine, it's humans, okay? That's in China. That's Chinese corn stacked by hand. China produces 8 billion bushels of corn a year now. Number 2 corn producer in the world. 95% of that corn is still harvested by hand. The Chinese corn market last week was $9.50-ish a bushel. We're going to talk a little about that and what that means. I tried not to put any gross meat pictures in because I knew I was the lunch speaker. But I did put a picture of some chicken feet. That thing in the middle, those are some chicken feet in China. I have some much worse ones, but that's as deep as I'm going here. 85% of U.S. chicken feet are exported to China and Hong Kong. They actually have a higher price for chicken feet than they have for chicken leg quarters. They love chicken feet. Just to show you the diversity of what we're dealing with when we talk about global markets, it's a very wide, diverse market. Over here, you can see the water buffalo and the little kid swimming on his water buffalo. India, now the number 2 exporter of beef worldwide. Who would have guessed that 10 years ago? I know I wouldn't have. Number 2 exporter in the world. We'll talk about that and what that means. So, 2 key drivers of global meat consumption. Population and income. I can run economic analysis back 40 years and say, what drives higher meat consumption? It's population and income. This is a Chinese water park. You can see the poor guy out there in the middle being photobombed by 5,000 of his nearest friends. I've been to the water parks with my kids in the summer, and I felt like that, but it wasn't quite like that. But we're going to talk about China and what that means. But the global population and global income growth is incredible. Take a look at this. Global middle class, if we go back to 2012, was 2 billion in the global middle class. We're going to 4.9 billion in that middle class by 2030. We're just seeing the tip of the iceberg here in terms of total consumer buying power overseas. We're going to add 3 billion people to the global middle class. Asia's middle class spent $5 billion in 2010. By 2030, they'll be spending $32 billion. These are countries that don't have the resources to produce their own food in a large way from what they've seen in the past. What I'm telling you here, it's good to be in agriculture. It's good to live in a country that has abundant resources and abundant food. It's good to be a producer of agriculture. World population. This is what I would consider a long-term chart. I don't know how many people lived in 5000 BC, but these were the published estimates. So we're going 5000 BC, we're projecting out to 2050. You take a look at that, it is absolutely staggering. Now this chart scares people. There are a lot of people that get terrified and say, we're going off the cliff, we can't make it, we're all going to starve to death. I've done the math. I've done some work for a company in the U.S. that wanted to know, how do we get to 2050 in terms of dairy, beef, eggs, pork? I've done the math. We can get there on a global basis, but we have to make sure we do not legislate away biotech, yield-enhancing efficiencies. We're not going to do this with organic grass-fed beef. and we're not going to do it with free-range chickens. We will starve billions of people if we do that. And so, hey, I'm all about choice. Market's going to pay you to grow organic beef, grow organic beef. We just got to make sure we don't legislate ourselves into a box where we can't supply the world's population with food. And I think this is a huge issue today. I think the real message, and I need a soapbox here so I can stand on it so you know when I'm on my soapbox. The real issue is we've got to help people understand that it is socially irresponsible to try and legislate away efficiency in agriculture. In the U.S., in Europe, all you hear about is free-range, grass-fed, antibiotic-free, blah, 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 whatever the foodies are talking about. Look, that's less than 1 billion people. The other 6 billion people, they don't care if it's GMO. They just want some food, right? When you have your belly full, you have lots of problems. When you don't have your belly full, you only have one problem, right? It's a big issue we gotta be aware of really getting the message out of what this means and the message of agriculture. And I know there are people who do a great job of that. I'm not one of those guys. There are people who do a great job of getting the message out in media, in agriculture. So as we look around the world, we have some big imbalances in the protein space. Beef, pork, and poultry. Here's some of those imbalances. We have shortages. And when I say shortage, I'm not saying people are clamoring in the street for it, but what I'm saying is we have record high prices. Chinese beef, Russia beef, pork, and poultry, U.S., Canada, Mexico beef, U.S. pork. All of them were record high prices this year. That tells me supplies were pretty tight. Key surpluses, EU pork. Russia banned all food imports from the U.S., Australia, Japan, and everyone else who disagrees with their Ukraine policy and over our sanctions. So they banned all of their meat imports other than Brazil and a few other countries. Russian prices are through the roof. Russian ham prices, $3.50 today. U.S. hams, 80, 90 cents. I mean, there's some real disparities going on around Russia. But even the bans around Russia. India beef, huge production. We'll talk about that. Brazilian beef, huge production. When we distill it all together, though, this is the chart out of all the charts that you probably ought to remember. And I said I'll make these slides available PDF so you can have access. Don't feel like you need to write everything down. These will be available through the Cattleman. But look at this. This is 2006 to 2015. This is production growth. I can look at any commodity, any agriculture commodity back to 1960. I cannot find one that has done what beef's just done. We have went 7 years with no discernible growth in production. Now we're adding 78 million people a year. I'm a pacer. I'm going to walk off this stage before I fall off. Otherwise I'm going to walk and you're going to see me go crash. We're adding 78 million people a year to the planet. Roughly 80 million. So do the math. We've went 7 years with no growth. We've added roughly 500 million people to the planet during that time period, and we've added about $10 trillion in global GDP, and we have put no more beef on the table. So what were those two key drivers? Population and income. $10 trillion, 500 million people, and no additional beef. And so what's the market reaction? Simple economics, right? The rubber band gets very tight between supply and demand, and the price goes straight up. And that's what we've seen. Now, if you could really zero in on that, the red line is 2015. What this chart says is the global beef production in 2015 will decline by 0.4% roughly than last year. It's a margin of error. Basically, stagnant growth again in 2015. So think about what that means as you look and say, what are prices going to be next year? They're going to be higher. We're going to add another 80 million people. We're going to add another $2 trillion in global GDP, and we're going to put no more beef on the market. So I'm not saying infinite growth is ahead. Mike Murphy at Cattle Facts is always like, you talk and people get so bulled up they never think there's ever going to be a bad day. Bullish, bullish, bullish. We're never going to have a bad day. Markets are like airplanes, right? We haven't left one up there yet. They all come down. Now this one's going to be up there for a while. It's not coming down anytime soon, but it's still an airplane. Okay? So So where are we going in the future? This is the United Nations forecast of what the world's going to need in terms of consumption. So what they're saying here is from 2013 to 2023, the world will need 27 million tons more poultry. For reference, the U.S. produces about 17 million tons of poultry. So the world's going to need 150% of what the U.S. produces today. We're going to need that 9 years from now. Pork, 14 million tons. Beef, 9 million tons. So what I just showed you is for 7 years, we have had zero beef production globally. We're going to need 9 million tons more beef in the next 10 years. That's pretty positive, right? Now, I don't know if we get there or not. That's what consumption needs. We're going to be fighting to get to that level. So you have that tight supply, you have the strong demand, and what happens to prices? Now, we've all seen where the U.S. prices are. I just looked, the Torrington auction report in Wyoming, they had 515-pound steers brought $3.15 last week. Absolutely incredible. When my last year on the ranch, it was 1999, and I sold calves for 92 cents. 1999, $3.15 for those calves today. So you're all saying, why should we listen to this guy? He totally missed that one, huh? I should have stayed and raised cattle. No, but on the global prices, October up 25% from a year ago. This isn't the U.S. price, globally. And so what I'm telling you, this is a global phenomenon. We all see the U.S. price. Global price is red hot. Look at that 5-year average, how far away it is. This is huge price increase. So what's happening here? We're getting a lot more consumer money coming into the industry. These profits give us a huge opportunity. And I was sitting in here listening to Warren Weibert this morning. If you think about this, this is a chance to truly look at your operation and say, how do I make myself better? Now, don't forget how to make money on $1.50 calves, because someday in the future, we might have to survive on $1.40, $1.50 calves. But how do I improve the quality of my product? How do I get more efficient? How do I get better at what I'm doing? Because you have a chance through higher profits to truly upgrade and get better and more competitive at what you do. Enormous opportunity, not just here but globally. The Brazilians, they're all getting way more into genetics over this. They're getting a lot more money. They're upgrading their genetics. They're looking at everything they can do. And that's what's going to happen around the world. So here's a trend chart just to show you global beef producers, who's doing what. You can see that big decline from the U.S. You can see Brazil's increase. You can also see that blue line down there. That was India. And so even though some of these countries are increasing production, our declines are still enough to make globally stagnant beef growth. So on a 5-year change basis, there's India and Brazil. In 5 years, India has had the biggest growth out of anyone in beef production. Brazil's right behind them. But then you drop off pretty quick, and when you blend those all together, you have no production growth. But there you can see the countries. Pakistan, I guess, producing some more beef. Some of these countries, Uzbekistan, I didn't know they produced beef, but they're in decline for whatever it's worth. But by and large, India and Brazil are the only two growing. And Brazil's been expanding for some time now. They're not done yet. Now let's flip over, look at exports in terms of the trend. There you can see India and Brazil. Look at that blue line and red line. It's interesting because India was so close to becoming the biggest beef exporter in the world. They missed it by that much for 3 years. They were so close to being the biggest. But they just caught when Brazil's expansion hit, both of them growing. There's Australia. Look how quick Australia's beef exports went up and how quick they're going down next year. I've circled that for a key reason. We don't compete much with Brazil and India. We compete very directly with Australia. Not only do we compete with them in Japan and Korea and key markets, they're also the key supplier of the beef we import. Beef imports are up 25% year to date. It's because we have record high grinding prices. 90s beef prices, coal cows, you've all seen it. Record high. So what that's doing, that's pulling beef in. Australia is shipping a lot of that beef. What I'm showing you, we're not going to have that beef next year from Australia, not as much. That's going to further tighten our supply next year. So let's look at a timeline of what's going on in Australia. 2013, their beef cow herd hits a 37-year high. Huge growth in their cow herd, 14 million cows. 2013, they get in a drought. The drought worsens, it gets tougher. At the same time, China comes on, tries to corner the Australian market, buying all the beef they can get out of Australia. Australia's drought slaughtering cattle. Then all of a sudden we have happen what happens here. Our 90s prices go. We're bidding as aggressive as we can. And Australia is going right through a drought right now with huge demand from U.S. and from China. And so they're killing cattle very aggressively. One, because they have to, and two, because the prices are very good. And so what does that do? That shrinks your cow herd. Anybody from Texas can tell you that. They're doing what we had happen in Texas 2 years ago. And so January 1, 2015, Australia's cow herd's going to be 1 million head smaller. And their exports are going to drop and their production's going to drop. And so that's going to really tighten our 90 supply and also tighten the supply of Australian beef into China, other key Asian markets. So another piece of that is Australian live cattle. Australia exports about 80,000 live cattle per month. Most of them go to Indonesia. And so demand is very strong for those live cattle. Vietnam just signed a deal this year to buy Australian cattle. China has a deal pending to buy Australian live cattle. So that deal gets done. Some people are saying China could buy 1 million live cattle a year out of Australia. And you look at the numbers, yeah, they could, and it wouldn't even influence their balance sheet on cattle because of the scale of China. So bottom line is the Australian market is shrinking, the production is shrinking against a very tight global situation. There's that Australian drought. You can see the red areas are the most severe drought. This is a 2-year map. And if you look at that northeast region, that state right there is Queensland, and that's a key cattle area. Queensland and down the east coast and then up the top over towards Darwin, that's some of the key cattle areas of Australia. You can see how tough the drought is over there. So next year, this chart shows their exports by where that Australian beef's going. Look at 2015. If we're going to get more beef from them next year, this was for Cattle Facts. Randy said, we're going to get more Australian beef. So I put the slide together and said, if we do, we've got to outbid Japan, Korea, China, Indonesia. We've got to take it from everybody to get a growth rate. I don't think we're going to get it. One, because some people say, how do other countries outbid us? We're the big buyers. Side note, I went to China first time probably 10 years ago. I get to China. I'm an economist. I do the math. I'm like, average per capita income in China is $1,000 a year. The average person lives on $1,000 a year in China. So I'm expecting to go to a very poor country. So we're driving down the major highways there in Beijing. They have these 5, 10, I don't know how wide the highways are. And we're driving through there, and I'm looking out the window and I'm seeing Rolls Royces and Bentleys and cars that I have never seen before in my life in America. And I'm going, how does this work? But you think about it, China's really 2 countries. There are 400 or 500 million peasant farmers. There are 600 or 700 million urban dwellers. There's 1.3 billion people. So if you take the wealthiest 10% of China, that's 130 million people. That's bigger than the population of Japan, the wealthiest 10% of China. And so you do that math and go, China can outbid us for things. Even though they live on 1/7 of our income or less, they can outbid us because of the unique nature of beef in China. So this is going to be a real tug-of-war next year in terms of who gets the beef. In terms of cattle slaughter, I usually use beef production, but since India's come on, I have to use slaughter because under the USDA stats, India doesn't produce any beef. They don't show up when I do the beef chart because it's all water buffalo. But if I do slaughter, you can see it. But you can see that big growth. This is 2008 to 2015. You can see India's growth. That growth is not over yet. India is going to continue to produce more and more cattle and more beef. We'll talk about it in just a minute. So here's what I wanted to cover. Brazil, China, India. What's going on in the global beef? Brazil's #1 exporter, China's the #1 importer, India's the #2 exporter. So in the Brazilian world, if you look at in cattle, they have more cattle than we do, but the U.S. has always been the biggest beef producer because of our carcass weights, our yields, our efficiency. Within 2 years, Brazil could become the largest beef producer in the world. They're heavily expanding, they're charging ahead. They began retaining heifers about 5 years ago, and we were watching that cow herd start to grow about 5 years ago. Now they're in full-scale beef production expansion as well. Brazilian beef exports were up 9% probably this year. They'll be up 10% again next year. Record high next year for Brazil. But get this. Top markets for Brazilian beef are #1 Russia, Hong Kong, Venezuela, Egypt, and Iran. That's 71% of their beef exports. That's a very, very small piece of our beef exports. And so that's what I'm saying. We don't necessarily compete real head-to-head with Brazil, other than Hong Kong and a little bit into Egypt. But it's really a differentiated product, two different products. In terms of their balance sheet, here's where their beef production is. That blue area is production. You can see consumption, and then you can see the exports there. Brazil's market, really, one of their best markets is Brazil. Because when you talk about population, income, both are growing. The best thing that could happen for all of us is for Brazil's economy to do well and more of that beef to stay in Brazil and tighten the markets even further. When their economy does well, their consumption picks up. Flip over to imports. Here's key global beef importers. This is a monthly chart. For years, the U.S. was the biggest beef importer in the world. But you can see there in 2012, that red line, that's China plus Hong Kong. Within 6 months, something snapped, and China became the #1 beef importer in the world. And it happened very quickly. And they remain there today. You can see September 2004, record high. Strong price inflation, strong demand. Now in China, they eat about 85 pounds of pork per person per year. They only eat about 9 pounds of beef per person per year. Beef is very rare in China. It's a very small, it would be similar maybe to seafood here, or probably less than that. A pretty small item. Used to be. Now everyone's looking for it. If we look at that Chinese balance sheet, there you can see production's the blue line, consumption's the orange line, imports are the balance. So if I say take a pencil and trend line both of these out for me, where are we going? I think it's safe to say that consumption trend line is probably going to stay steady, if not better. Production, we're turning the corner downhill. Now there's two responses to producers when prices get very high. And in the U.S., what happens? We start retaining heifers, right? Prices go up, we start holding heifers. I'll give you another example. Russia in 1990 had beef prices very high. Russia had 46 million cows in 1990. Every year from 1990 to 2004, Russian beef prices went higher, higher, higher. What did the Russians do? They went from 46 million cows to about 15 million cows in 10 years. Because it's different here. When we see high prices, we expand, we borrow money, we invest, we grow. In Russia, and I think in China, you have a lot of cash-poor farmers that are going to see this as their chance. As the price goes up, they're going to sell more cows. And the price goes up, more cows. I just have to look at this and wonder if China doesn't follow more of that Russian model, the price gets so high, all the small farmers sell more and more cows. The challenge is going to be meeting the gap. Right there you can see that gap is about 1 million tons of beef today. We can't supply 3 or 4 million ton gaps unless we really expand beef production. So, U.S. produces about 9-10 million tons of beef today. So 1 million tons is a big deal. So what's driving this China thing? I showed you the pictures of the Chinese beef rolled up. The last time I was in China, I think every restaurant I went to had some kind of beef on the table. That wasn't the case before. I went to one restaurant, it was a cheap street restaurant, it wasn't where tourists would eat at all. They had lean yellow fat beef, frozen rolled up for hot pot. Beef has just become for whatever reason, the new thing in China. And the only thing I can equate it to, it's like cell phones or cars or whatever it is. Everyone wants a piece of beef in China. And if you're going out to dinner, you want a piece of beef. It's not a lot. Like I say, you may just eat a couple rolled up frozen slices boiled in chili paste. But everybody wants a little bit. And so here's the beef price. This is an index back to January 2012. This is the retail beef price. And China reports their price. They report beef leg. I don't know what they mean by leg. That may still have the hoof attached. I don't know. But beef leg price increased 40%. And you can see back there in 2012, remember when they became the biggest importer in the world was back here in 2012? That's right where that inflation took off. And so the price is stabilized. It's just stabilized at a very high level. Very high prices. It's not broken. So you look at what pork's done, you look at chicken and beef. Incredible in China, that demand. China's middle class is estimated to be about 300 million people. Again, they have 1.3 billion. So 300 million of them are middle class. That's expected to double by 2022. 300 million more Chinese in the middle class in 8 years. What's beef demand going to do? I don't know. I don't know the future, but I'm just saying it looks pretty bright to me. Recent study came out comparing products. 60% of Chinese were willing to pay more for products that say made in the USA. And in the food sector, if you go into China, the educated, the wealthy in the big cities, they all want to eat US food for a very obvious reason. They have a few problems regulatorily in China's food sector. They have had food safety scandals over and over and over throughout all their commodities, dairy, everything. So if they have a chance to buy US, they love it. In fact, I know a guy, he's working with a Chinese retailer. Their entire business model is to source everything from Europe and the US and Canada for Chinese retailers. I think it's a brilliant model. I think it'll do very well in China because of their food safety problems. So in terms of the beef going into that market, if you add China plus Hong Kong plus Vietnam, and that's complicated, but all the Indian beef is going through Vietnam, a lot of beef's going through Hong Kong, but we call that the Greater China region. India is supplying 37% of that market. We talked about the Indian beef, number 2 exporter in the world. That's where most of it's going, right into China. Brazil, you can see US is about 10% of that market with our shipments into Hong Kong. It's a huge, diverse market. I wouldn't say we really compete with any of these countries. It has a lot of room for cheap Indian water buffalo. It has a lot of room for grain-fed beef. It's just a huge, diverse market. So in terms of imports, that Greater China region again, they're importing, you can see here, 7 billion pounds of meat every year. That's 3% of their consumption. So if I look at Chinese resources, they're water starved, they're land starved, they have pollution issues, and they're both their water and their land. There's only so much they can do to try and produce more. The government actually just shut down their GMO research division. They quit funding research into GMOs in China. And I'm going, when you're a country with no more land and no more water, and you just backed away from GMOs, that tells me they're going to be much bigger importers in the future. Much bigger. Here's something, this is kind of a sidebar, but it's something you got to watch as we look into 2015. Half the pigs in the world live in China. Half the pork production and consumption is in China. It's a huge pork market. We do a lot of research and work on the pork markets, and so we follow China very closely. This is a big deal. From January 2013, China began liquidating sows. They begin losing money. The farmers are losing money. They're still feeding, I mentioned, they're feeding $9.50 corn today. So they lose money. Half the farmers in China are backyard farmers. They're the guy with 2 pigs in his backyard. So they're losing money. They don't go finance and keep their 3 pigs alive. They just sell pigs. And so as that goes on, take a look at this. 5.9 million head liquidated since January 2013. Do you know how many pigs there are in the U.S., or how many sows? Does anybody know? About 5.9 million head. So China just liquidated the same amount of sows as we have in the U.S. Now, their market, I follow the Chinese hog market weekly, very closely, especially right now. And the market's kind of soft, not moving up at all. But I go fast forward 3 months, 4 months, 5 months. If you do the math here, go back to February, March when those big declines hit, those pigs would be hitting the market right about now. In the next 5 months, we are going to see a massive supply gap in the Chinese pork market. Potentially next year, 50 to 70 million hogs short of what they need. Now, we've seen this happen twice. We saw it in 2008, we saw it in 2011. Disease-driven. They had disease issues. When they got short of pork, they stepped in and bought a lot of U.S. pork. They drove our markets crazy. 2011, for 2 months, they bought 8% of our entire production for 2 months. Today, they're not buying much. Very little U.S. pork going in. One problem is we have a ractopamine ban, the Paline, Optiflex, the same thing. China bans that, and so we only have about 15% of our hogs that can even produce pork for China. But again, we can export to Hong Kong. And so looking into 2015, I didn't know where to put this slide, but I thought this is something to put on your radar, is we may see enormous demand for imported pork into China within the next 5 or 6 months. Here's why. It's China corn. But get this. Here's an economics problem for you. China corn supplies are huge. They have enormous stocks of corn right now. Demand has fallen. They liquidated all those sows. They don't need it. They have lots of corn, and the price was $9.62 a bushel last week. How do you reconcile that as an economist? What's going on? The Chinese government is absolutely committed to high-priced corn in China. The government is, all those big storages, those big supplies, it's Chinese government bins. The Chinese government has aggressively bought corn off the market and stored it to support this price. And then they banned imports. They banned DDG imports. They played with the sorghum market. But they desperately need those high prices so Chinese corn farmers will plant corn next year. That's their biggest fear, is we've got to keep farmers planting corn. And so they've pulled back. They've controlled that market. They've bought and put in storage. Their government storage numbers are going straight up. They have been for about 5 years. But they have driven that corn market through the roof. And as such, they put 6 million sows out of business. And so that's the situation. A lot of guys look at this and go, why don't they just buy cheap U.S. corn? They can book our corn at $4. Well, the problem is, if they do that and their corn farmers don't plant 8 billion bushels of corn next year, we can't send them 8 billion bushels of corn. There's not enough traded corn in the world to save them if they have a problem in their farm sector. So they're obviously very concerned about getting enough corn planted in China. But it's wreaking havoc on these markets, especially in the hog markets. That poster, 1970s, that's an old Chinese propaganda poster. And if you think back, 1950s, they had the Great Leap Forward, Chairman Mao. I just read a book on this. The estimates are somewhere between 30 and 40 million Chinese starved to death from 1958 to about 1962 over failed government grain policy 50 years ago. So changes in grain policy are a big deal in China, and they put out all this propaganda about we need more grain, more food. Huge global ag policy deal is the Chinese corn market. So the Chinese measures things in self-sufficiency. They want to know, how self-sufficient are we in food production? It's production divided by consumption. There you can see what happened to the beef market. They've lost 6% of their beef self-sufficiency very quickly. You can see corn they're holding. Most of them, they try and stay in that 100% range. They can't do this forever. The resources will not allow them to continue to produce more. And so we're going to see them, the way they manage it is they set target rates for self-sufficiency. So say that we get a news headline and China says, we've lowered our self-sufficiency target from 100% for corn down to 95% for What does that mean? Oh, I took my slide off. 5% it's 2 million tons of corn for every percent. So that's 10 million tons of corn if they go from 100 to 95. Beef, every 1% is about 58,000 tons, every percent they lose. All right, let's shift gears. We'll talk about India for a minute. Largest cattle inventory in the world, 300 million cattle in India. Problem is, cow slaughter's banned. The Brahman cattle are the sacred cattle to the Hindus. It's illegal to slaughter a Brahman cattle in India. Does it happen? Yeah, some, but it's illegal. So what they've done, they have expanded their production of water buffalo. And Indians don't eat much meat, but they consume a lot of dairy, a lot of milk. They're huge milk producers. But their efficiency is terrible because they're milking water buffalo. But these water buffalo produce half the crop is male, half the crop's female, right? And so where does that half crop that's male go? It didn't go anywhere before. It wandered in the streets. And then some enterprising non-vegetarians, some Muslims in northern India said, hey, we can slaughter these calves and export them. Beef price is high. And boom, here's a beef industry. Not just a beef industry, the number 2 beef exporter in the world, very quickly driven by this water buffalo production. Very sensitive issue in India. They just had an election, elected President Modi about 3 months ago. President Modi was campaigning and said, if you elect me president, I will ban all cattle slaughter in India. Now, I would say he was maybe pandering to the Hindu vote, which he needed to win. He has not banned all cattle slaughter in India. I don't know if Indian politicians ever break campaign promises. We would never do that here, but maybe he made a campaign. I don't know. We'll have to watch and see. It's a big deal, though. Number 2 beef exporter in the world. So there's the sacred cow, the Brahman cattle. You can see they paint them all up, and they're really the celebrated religious cattle. Now here's their country cousin, the water buffalo. Fair game to eat, milk, whatever you need to do. But there you can see that trend in what's going on with buffalo. That was the picture I had up front with the kid swimming on the back of the buffalo. That was a kid with his little herd of water buffalo. Huge business, but there's about 177 million Muslims in India out of 1 billion people, so it's a small percent, but they're making a lot of money. India's beef exports now are about $4 billion a year. That's a big thing to the Indian economy. I think it would be hard to ban it politically. I think it would be hard to ban that. So their top, this is a busy chart, but their top 15 beef exports go to those countries on the left. That's their top 15. It's 93% of their exports go to these countries. Brazil only sends 22% of their beef exports to those countries. We send 4% of our beef exports to those countries. So that's what I'm saying. We really don't compete with India. I've seen Indian beef overseas. I was in the Philippines and I saw some cooked canned beef from India. It was a big can. It was like a big can of chili like you see here, cooked Indian beef. It was 16 cents for that can of beef. And no, I didn't buy it and eat it. I looked at it and went, ooh, that's got to be terrible. 16 cents a can, it cannot be good. So it's a very unique market. So some of the forecasts, again, this is what I showed you before. It's just a different chart. There's what we've done in terms of historical beef production. There's our 7 years of stagnation. And there's a forecast of where FAO says we need to go. It is possible. You look at that chart and go, yeah, it follows a long-term trend line. The market's telling us to do this, right? The message from the market is make more beef. We need more beef. That's what the market's showing us. So another 9 million tons, maybe, maybe not. Huge support, though. This is a busy, messy chart, but I just broke that number down and said, where's it going to come from? Here's where the FAO says the production's going to come from. They have China producing another 1 million tons of beef. I don't think that's going to happen. China's very dedicated to corn production and pretty dedicated to pork production. They're not real excited about stimulating the beef markets in China for production. And there you can see the big U.S. decline correcting after 2016. These are, again, UN estimates. But a little bit more from everybody is basically where that 9 million tons comes from. So in terms of the U.S., you can see there the imports up this year big, maybe up next year. I'm not real confident in that 4% import increase just because I know how tight the global market supplies are. Exports down 1%. In terms of value, when we look, every head that you sell, every head that gets slaughtered in the U.S., $352 of that animal comes from yen, pesos, yuan, rubles, whatever. Comes from overseas. $352 a head now coming from overseas. Look at where we were before BSE. We were less than $200 a head. Huge demand for U.S. beef overseas. There's the forecast I've got for 2015. I've got exports down 1%, which is really a huge victory when production's going to be down probably 3%. We only have so much to sell. But I think if you look at it in terms of dollars, not pounds, dollars will be higher next year, exported beef in dollars. But there you can see the growth markets. Really, Hong Kong, Mexico's going to keep buying. Other than that, somebody's got to go without, right? In terms of imports, that's what we're looking at. That Australia one, that's a big jump. Again, that's drought slaughter that drove that big supply of Australian beef into the U.S. Here's the key to watch. This is a chart of our 90% lean beef price. If you want to keep your finger on the pulse of the global beef market, watch that 90s lean price. Look at the jump there. You can see where we were in 2009. This isn't a long-term chart. $1.50 a pound. $3 now. And we just can't break. I mean, that 90s price has been flat for 4 months now, just right there. I think we're going to be back at 3 or above 3 as we go into spring. What does that mean? That's what your cull cows are priced on. This is basically your cull cow market. Cull cows are going to be higher. The market's going to make that decision as hard as it can for you, whether to send her to market or keep her another year because of the tight supplies. I'm not going to go through that. Supply catch up to demand? Yes, we talked about this. The profit, huge opportunity. Yes, it will catch up. It's going to be 3 to 5 and maybe 5+ years before we really can see the global market begin to stabilize. Some of the watch list items, beef, pork, and poultry are all profitable. Expansion's going to take time. We talked about China. Beef access, I said China's recently cracked that market open to some other suppliers. Probably going to surprise us one of these days and open to U.S. TPP, that's the Trans-Pacific Partnership. And I say DOA. I don't know. I did this at the Cattlemen's the other day and Forrest Roberts got mad at me. We're going to get a TPP deal done. Don't be talking that thing down. TPP, the big deal is this is our trade agreement with 25 nations, but the only one that matters really is Japan. This is our chance to drag Japan to the negotiating table and have that arm wrestle. And the administration, in my opinion, is bent on announcing something. They just want to come out and say, we got a deal. And they floated the idea of a TPP light, which is just watered down, which I think is an utter failure if that's all we get. And so what I'm hoping is the administration will stay tough and keep negotiating. Japanese are tough negotiators. They'll wear us out. But hopefully we get something done. Our beef duties, FYI, to Japan, 38%. We pay a 38.5% duty on beef going into Japan. We pay 0 to Mexico, 0 to Canada, 0 to a lot of places, 38%. So say we get that down below 10%, it's probably going to be a phase out over time. That's a big deal. TPP is a huge opportunity. I just hope our administration will hang tough and keep negotiating. MCOOL, didn't really talk about that much. That's the country of origin labeling. That's the lawsuit we have, the WTO with Canada and Mexico. Canada won the case and said MCOOL is illegal. So the deal is, Canada's now, well, the U.S. appealed. We're going to lose the appeal. Canada's going to come back and Mexico and say, we're going to impose retaliation duties on U.S. goods until Congress gets this put away. Now, I'm not an MCOOL fan. I think MCOOL was a government solution to a problem that didn't exist. And the way we've revised it has only made it worse. It's just put costs on our industry. I don't want it any more than the Canadians do. But the challenge is Congress has to unwind it. And so Canada's going to retaliate. They'll look at congressional districts and they'll say, which congressman's vote do we need? And what does that district produce and export to Canada? That's the duties we're going to put on. And so they're going to start this carousel retaliation probably about the middle of next year. And it'll be big news, trade war with Canada. They're going to be hitting all these different products. The big question is beef on the list? Yes, beef's on the list. Beef and pork are on the list. I've talked to the Canadians. I've said, please, find another product to hit. 30% of our pork goes to Canada and Mexico. 25% of our beef. We can't have that happen. I don't think they want to hurt our industry. I think they're in the same boat we are. You know, they know we don't want cool either. Hopefully they won't do that, but it's something to watch. If you wake up one day and we have 20% duties on beef going to Canada and Mexico, it's a big deal. Key indicator again is watching that 90s price. Do we have infinite price growth? No. I told you that, didn't I? Doesn't mean the markets are going up forever. We're not going to have infinite price growth. What I wanted to do here, so that was my global piece, and I think that really sets the stage for where we're at on a global basis. But because of this group, I wanted to show you at least some of the slides. I don't have near as many here, but just some of the slides of what Cattle Facts, what we put together for the Outlook last week, of where they see domestic supply and demand. We'll talk about expansion. We'll talk about what the data shows. Are we truly expanding the cow herd? Here's the record highs. So our herd size, it's really a perfect storm. Our herd size finally declines to the point the beef production goes lower. Our herd size has been declining for 15 years, but we've been producing almost the same amount of beef for a long time because of bigger carcass weights. In 2009, the beef production actually started dropping with the herd. So that was one major factor. Last year, we have the PED virus in pigs. You guys out here in Iowa know what that was. Huge deal. It just happened at the same time that the beef market got very tight. We lose 5 million plus pigs to PED virus. Broiler hatchers, in a weird, I still don't totally understand, have had hatchability problems in their breeding flock. I didn't know this before, but about 3 companies control 3/4 of the world flock of broiler chicks. And they go, wait, some of our chicks were having some fertility issues. They're still working those out. So it's almost odd that you have a situation where beef, pork, and poultry, no one can expand. The market's saying expand, and no one can expand. I thought the chicken guys would be on top of it. Look at the stock price of Tyson. Look what these chicken companies are doing. Huge profits. So you guys know what corn price is. Broilers are record high. So record high broilers, you look at where corn is from the last 2 years, chicken companies are making money. And I've said, how do you know when the chicken guys are going to expand? The second they can. They aren't exercising discipline here. They don't have the chicks. And so you have that on top of this. So as we look at what's happened this year, it really is a perfect storm. Flat global beef production for 7 years. We add all this together. China, huge demand. And what happens? Boom, all of a sudden we have record high prices across the beef complex. This is an older chart. It's October. It's a month old, or 2 months old, but it's $1 per head change from a year ago, just to show you where we were standing in October. Those 550-pound calves were $540 a head higher than they were a year ago. Feeders, $584. I mean, this is just incredible on a 1-year change. Corn's down $100 a head. That's just such a huge shift. And if we look at what it did in the calf markets, here's that 550-pound calf price. Now, if Cattle Facts would have come out a year ago and say, calf prices are going to average $260, $270 in 2014, people would have got up and left probably. No one, they're fed cattle at $1.70. We're going to get $1.70. In fact, I remember a year ago when they were getting ready for their outlook, because I do the international piece, I was meeting with them. We were comparing all our numbers. And I remember talking to Todd at Cattle Facts. I said, why do you guys have beef demand down? They had a big decline for 2014. Declining demand. And I go, what makes you think demand's going to be down? And he said, to be honest, when we run the number, we put in our supply and demand, based on what we see as supplies, that puts the price up above $1.50. This is when fed cattle were $1.20. He goes, we can't say fed cattle are going to be $1.50. One, it's crazy, and two, not even we believe it. So what do? We adjust demand downward to get the price where it's more palatable. And it's interesting because at Cattle Facts, that net supply this year was dead on. The forecast they made a year ago on where net supplies were, but nobody really dared step out and say prices are going through the roof. Kind of interesting. So per capita net beef supply, this is production plus imports minus exports divided by the population. This is how much beef is available for every American today. And you can see that big decline we had here And look where we did in 2014. Look how big that gap was. They're showing us bottoming out 2015, creeping back in 2016. Huge gap. That's really what fueled that. Fed slaughter down 5% roughly year to date. We've hit the point where we're truly in a very tight situation. Feeder and calf supply outside of feedlots. This is the calf pool that's available. If you're a feedlot, this is available cattle to bid on. 2015, it's going to be down 700,000 head more. So what does that mean? If you're a feedlot and you want to keep the yard full, you're going to have to chase them harder. You're going to have to chase that smaller supply harder with bids. So again, let me back that up. When you look at this, the feedlot world's a fixed capacity world, right? You've got to have per head capacity. It wasn't that long ago. 97, we were feeding 33 million head of cattle. We're down now to 24, 25. That's a capacity problem. That's a lot of empty bunks, isn't it? So the cow slaughter utility price, again, this is our 90s. So that red line is the utility cow price. So here we are on utility cows. We're 50 bucks for 20 years or so. All of a sudden we're 110 and we're going higher next year. And then over here is our cow slaughter. How many million head? That's cow and bull slaughter. So you can see that cattle cycle. You would think high prices make us slaughter more. No, the high prices are a result of not having enough. And so as we hold those cows back and hold the market, that price is going to be very well supported. If you're in the business of making money buying and selling hamburger next year, good luck. That's going to be a tough business. The restaurant guys are terrified of what 2015 is going to do to them in terms of lean grinding beef. Here's that 90s price. This is that lean grinding beef. There we go. We hit that 290 mark. Just stubborn resistance right there. And that's going to carry right into spring. Spring's probably going to peak. You look at the seasonal here. We have these spring highs. We get out into next spring, who knows? We're going to be up above 3 bucks, in my opinion, on that 90s price. So here's an interesting ratio. What about cheap poultry? Poultry's fairly cheap. So this is our 90% trim against the chicken breast. Look at that. So back here what this is saying is 90s, basically hamburgers versus chicken. You go to the fast food window, do you want hamburger, do you want chicken? So if you're those guys, beef was, the ratio was 0.5 here, the trim, beef trim to the chicken breast. Today we're up here at 2. That same pound of beef is twice the cost of chicken breast, where before it was down at half. That's a huge shift, huge shift. I think we're going to have some tough resistance above 2. I just think in the consumer mind, in that fast food world, it's a tough shift above 2, and we maybe pushed it a little high there. So I showed you this chart for beef, per capita net beef supplies. This is meat and poultry. So we throw chicken and pork in the mix. Look at that decline. U.S. consumers have cut 20 pounds per capita out of their diet here in 5 or 10 years. That's incredible to me. Incredible. It goes back to the economist question. It's the chicken or the egg. Are they not eating it because we're not producing it, or are we not producing it because they don't want it? And if you look at the beef market, I say they're not eating it because we're not producing it. If they didn't want it, 90s price wouldn't be 3 bucks right now. They want it. And I think we're going to turn the corner here and start to move that back up. Steer and heifer slaughter, you can see that big decline again. That's a huge year-over-year decline as we moved into 2014, really driving that. So what about expansion? That's a question. What do I do with heifers this fall? Do I keep them, breed them? God, I always hear, how do you not sell a $1,400 heifer calf? How do you keep that heifer calf? In terms of beef cow slaughter, we're down 18% year to date. We're retaining beef cows. We're not sending cows to the plant. That's why our 90s price is so high. So that's one indication that we're retaining. We're beginning to keep cattle. Here's another one, heifer slaughter as a percent of fed slaughter. And there you can see where the cattle cycles hit. Right now we're about 35%. Only 35% of our total slaughter is heifers. That shows that we're keeping more heifers in the mix. We're in an expansion phase. Here's the profit and loss. Now this is an average, and I always get grief when I say this is the average cow-calf profit, because everyone says, no, I'm way lower, way higher. Somebody told me once, an average chart tells you nothing. Get this. If you take the entire world, if you're the average person, you have one testicle and one breast. Does that make sense? Average doesn't fit anyone, is what I'm saying. So none of us are average, right? We're either here, there, or somewhere on the scatter chart. There's my average. But take a look at this. Average profit and loss for 20 years was $2 a head. For 20 years, those were the 20 years I was on the ranch. 20 years, you make $2 a head in the cow-calf world. We're up over 400, and I would say that's probably low. I talk to a lot of ranches. You look at where we're at. We're talking 400 to 600. So what's the market saying? It's a pretty clear signal, isn't it? Need more beef. That's what it's telling us. So here's our bred cow price. This is our dilemma. Bred cows now up here, 2,100 U.S. average for a bred cow. Next year, we're saying they're going to be 2,500. So how do you build? How do you expand? Is it too much? Am I paying too much for cows if I buy them? Here's a ratio for you. Number of 550-pound steer calves needed to buy a bred cow. So it's roughly 1.5. Where are we in 2014? 1.5. So that $1,500 calf, basically every steer calf's about $1,500, times 1.5 puts that bred cow at about $2,200. That's not a lot different than we were back here long term. Now, I get it. That makes sense. So I say, okay, buy the cow. But the question is, what's this going to look like the next 6 years of that cow's life? Right? And I don't know that. I'm just telling you, I think with the slides I've shown, it looks pretty good. There are a lot more reasons to be optimistic than pessimistic in this business. But then again, I'm not out here windrowing piles of these bred cows either. But that's more of a financial problem than an economic problem. I need a banker with poor judgment. Do we have any of those guys here? So this is what our beef cow inventory is looking like. You can see those big cycle highs in the inventory. Really, this was a cycle peak, 2006, 2007. We had good profits. That was the cycle peak. It doesn't look like much of a peak, but here we go now, that big drop. And here's where we start turning the corner in our beef cow inventory. So we're looking at this. I don't think we're going back to 34, 33 million beef cows. We're probably going to stabilize up there 32, maybe 33, right in that area. But only time will tell. But the money is there to grow this business. We have a pretty clear signal. So prices and outlook. There's the seasonal. That's a 550-pound steer price. See that 10-year? That's the seasonal of calf price. High, the peak's right there when we can't find any and it's grass season, and the low's here when everyone sells them. Here's 2014. Just incredible. Totally contra-seasonal. Longer you held them, the more you made. Here's the annual price. Again, this is an average annual, so it's not useful other than it just shows you the difference, what we're looking at into 2015. Average annual 500-pound calf price was $243, or will be roughly that this year. $260 is the estimate by Cattle Facts for next year. Higher, higher, higher. 750 feeders, you can see there, pretty seasonal other than we just didn't get the break in Sept Oct. We just keep churning higher. And the forecast for 2015 for feeders, Cattle Facts' forecast is 232. So you can plug that in on your break-even calculator. Fed price seasonal, you can see there the seasonal. Usually you get that low. July, August is the low in the Fed price. Didn't happen this year. Not by a long shot. And away we go. So the Fed price average for 2014's $1.55 average. 2015, the estimate is $1.62. Higher. Higher, higher, all the way through. So there's where we were at that $1.26 a year ago, thinking, I think the outlook last year, Cattle Facts was saying $1.34, probably be where we're at. I don't think anyone, I'm not bashing Cattle Facts. I'm asking if anyone thought this would happen. I think they did pretty good on their supply estimate, but boy, happened quick. Here's another piece of the business. Access to credit. This is if you're feeding cattle, how much credit you got to have per head. 2010, we needed about $1,200 per head credit to put cattle on feed. Today, we're at $2,100. we all better be maintaining those banker relationships, right? We need bankers in this business, and we need to have a good relationship with them. The access to capital, the credit requirements are enormous in this business. All right. So my second summary, I'm really going to quit this time. I'm not going to bring up another 50 slides here when I'm done. Tight supplies equal higher prices. We're going to see this cow herd expand 2 to 3 years. We're starting to see that already. Highest prices we have will likely be 2015. Key items to watch are the chicken and pig expansion, retail price spreads, and the foreign trade piece.